Welcome to the Incubator Podcast. This is your co-host, Apiiro Saran.
And this is Darren Boyd. Today we're joined by Idan Plotnik, who's the CEO and co-founder of Apiiro. Apiiro started in 2019, addressing something very unique in the industry. To date, they've raised $135 million across Series B. And what they've built is, it feels like if I could just envision my most optimistic or perfect way to address cybersecurity, feels like Idan's always one step ahead, and he and his team have created something just absolutely remarkable. What they've built, I'll try and just frame it up, and then we'll get Idan to really go into some of the details. What they've built is a code risk platform that addresses risk inherent in any material change long before it ships to prod. And I mean long before. It can be all the way in the ideation phase, which I think we're missing. And given the asymmetry of how many developers there are to security practitioners, we feel that this is an absolute critical element. Now, what they have built goes so much deeper than that, but that's the crux of what they're solving in my terms. But Idan, why don't we turn it over to you for a moment? If you could introduce yourself, your background, why you started Apiiro, and then maybe we'll dive into some of the details of what Apiiro is solving.
Sure. So first and foremost, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor. So I'm maybe 60 seconds about myself. I'm 22 plus years in the cybersecurity industry. Started as an engineer at the IDF. Then I had a consulting services company doing a lot of penetration testing, security code review, and threat models. I even custom development of tools. I sold this company in 2011. Then I started a startup, we were back then pioneers in the UEBA space, user and entity behavior analytics space. I sold this company to Microsoft in 2015. And at Microsoft, I was a GM for software engineering, running product management, software engineering, data scientists, and security research. And at Microsoft, I was running what today is called Defender for Identity business. And I felt it was the first time in my life that I felt a huge challenge and a pain when we embedded the risk management processes and the security tools and processes into the development lifecycle. So instead of delivering faster, it was just blocking us from moving faster and faster. And we, just for you to understand, we were pure microservices with CI/CD. Everything was cutting edge. Technically speaking, we could deliver code to production multiple times a day. But then you need to answer these 150 questions in the risk assessment questionnaire. And then you have 6 different scanning tools. And then you have pen tests and threat models. And all these alerts created cacophony and stop us from releasing faster and faster. So to make a long story short, this was a business blocker. And this was the catalyst to start Apiiro. So this is me and the quick story of why we decided to start Apiiro at the end of 2019.
Awesome, Idan. So, I think you've set the stage a bit. Now, let's just unpack that even further, right? So that was pain and suffering you saw that you yourself was facing. Let's magnify that. So where do you think enterprises are most struggling in that traditional sense of application security programs, right? Where you have all the scanning tools, but yet again, they're facing the same challenges you have. And then how does Apiiro now begin to address that pain?
So I like to simplify things, but let me make it a little bit complex and then go back and simplify.
Sure.
So first and foremost, in today's world, in 2023, there is, because of the complexity of modern applications and software supply chains, something happened. Like there is a completely new interconnected attack surface between the way you develop the software, the way you build it, and the way you deliver it. It's a new attack surface because it's not only protecting the application code from SQL injection. It's protecting the code from SQL injections and API vulnerabilities and secrets in code and containers and the permissions on your CI/CD pipelines and the permissions on your GitHub server and the way you sign and build and ship the application to the cloud. So it's a very interconnected new attack surface. And now let's break it down to silos and simplify and then build it again. So why I said that it's an interconnected, completely new attack surface? Because the current tools, the SaaS, the SCA, the DAS, the IaaS, and the new edge siloed software supply chain companies, they don't see the end-to-end story. Okay, and if you don't see the end-to-end story, you will have the same problem like from 10 years ago, where you looked at only network traffic and then layer 7 and then WAF, and then you build it in layers, and the attackers still manage to breach while you have all these solutions. So we want to think about this differently, okay, as a whole, as an end-to-end with all the context, so you can actually prevent risks, like Darren said, early in the development lifecycle before you reach to production. But having said that, you can miss things, or you can release without risks, and then when you deployed it, the risk coming later on, so you need to close the remediation loop and say, okay, I deployed my application. When I deployed it, there was no risks, but now a week later, 6 months later, there was a vulnerability in open source or in a base image or other stuff. And then you need to tie it back to the source code, to the code components, to the user story, to the code owner to close the remediation. So, but it's too much. I want to go back to your original question and stop me if I'm talking too much, okay? So going back to the enterprises, what they do, most of them decided to check the box for compliance on SAST and SCA. Great, did it, bought, paid a lot of money for these tools. Now it took time to implement them. And then guess what? You have 10,000 repos. Now you enable SAST and SCA on 10,000 repos, you create cacophony. You create 10,000 alerts and huge backlog. Now what? And then came the, let's say, the new edge of companies, shift left companies, which says, great, let's take all these alerts and shift them to the developers. But guess what? It created cacophony and friction. And then the developers said, hey, 95% of it, I'm spending my time on false positives. And I don't know if I need to fix it. And then you need to prioritize. Should I work on features, or should I fix these or triage these false positive alerts? And I think this is the last 15 years of the AppSec industry, 15 plus years of the AppSec industry. Now we are getting into, and let's call it, let's celebrate. Gartner released 4 or 5 days ago the ASPM report, the Application Security Posture Management, yet another acronyms. But they're saying, which I totally agree, you need to ingest all the data from all these tools. You need to deeply understand the application architecture the components and the relationship between them. You need to understand the developer knowledge and activity. And then you need to augment business context on top of that, because I don't care about SQL injection on an API in a test code, which never deploys to production. Or maybe it's a SQL injection in an application that generates 0.1% of the revenue. Who cares? Like, going back to Darren's point, there are small amount of AppSec engineers and a lot of developers, and these developers need to bring business value. They need to develop features. You have sprints, you have business requirements that are coming from your customers, and you need to deliver. So I think we are in a very, very, very unique point in AppSec where we can literally change the market. Like I don't know if you like this comparison, but I compare it to the transformation in endpoint security. 8 years ago, you had antiviruses. Now the evolution was EPP, XDR, all these acronyms. And today you have one platform that deals with the endpoint, with the identity, with with the data in one platform. I think this is what's going on, what's going to happen in the AppSec space in the next 3 years. And you know what? Even less than 3 years. I think in a year to 2 years from now, everything will look totally different. And you will have the top three, the top three companies that shifted this market, which can actually help the AppSec, the AppSec engineer save time, triaging alerts, prioritizing, and actually fixing or helping the developer fix what really matters to the business. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that was great, Idan.
I'm talking too much.
No. We love that because this is fascinatingly complex.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe you've laid out the problem statement, which is historically this AppSec has lacked context, right? And in a world where increasingly context is king, Apiiro is on this direction to not only provide that context, but ultimately de-risk your application security posture, if we will, right? So do I have that right, Idan?
Spot on, 100% accurate. I think context is the key and the king, but context can mislead the audience, because let's double click for a second on what context means, okay? Context means that first and foremost, you can't look at code and understand what's going on here. It's so complex. So you need an abstraction layer on top of your code of saying, okay, this is an API, this is a dependency, this is an SDK, this is a data model, this is where you have PII in this data model. This is a data access object that deserialize or serialize data to a database or a storage bucket or a log file. And then you need to build a graph on top of these code components, which gives you a view of how your application is assembled and architectured. On top of that, you need to say, okay, who developed this API? Who added this dependency? When? Who approved it? Tie it back to the user story and augment business context on top of that, of saying, great, these components are one application, and it's a little bit more complex because it's great that you identify the API in the code, but is it related to an API gateway in my cloud environment? Where is it running in my Kubernetes cluster? And which CI/CD pipeline actually built and deployed this application? So you need to end the end-to-end story and augment business impact. How do you augment business impact? And this is one of the core differentiator of Apiiro. When we connect to the source control manager, we are doing a multi-dimensional risk assessment. We understand the data types. We understand the knowledge of the developers. We are trying to understand how many developers across your organization are working on this application. And more factors that gets into the equation of saying automatically, without any human intervention, without the risk assessment questionnaires, saying, hey, 35% of your repos were classified as high business impact. Now you can augment the static data that you have from your risk management and GRC systems, which is great, but what we learned that it's static there, and in our case, it's dynamic and it's changing on a daily basis, because you can start an application and suddenly Darren, the top-notch Java developer in this mobile application, suddenly added PII data and exposed it via API. Now, who knows that? No one. So you need to dynamically assess the code changes, understand if it's material or not, understand the risks on top of that, and based on the multi-dimensional risk assessment, classify what's the business impact. And only then, with this capability, you're able to triage and put guardrails for the developers. Because if you will put guardrail for developers today in 2023, and you will break the build or block the pull request on every CVSS score 8 and above on an open source dependency, you're done. Or someone will fire you, or the developers will remove you for the pipeline and say, I don't want to work with this guy. He doesn't understand our domain, and he's blocking us from delivering business value to the organization. So I think this is the core differentiator of Apiiro. We built an abstraction layer on top of the code, and we built a risk graph where you can ask us any question on your code, developer knowledge, CI/CD pipeline, and in a very unique way, tie it back to the user story. Why? Because as Darren said at the beginning of the session, you need to identify the risks before you started coding. And how you do that? You, in the Apiiro case, and it's very unique to Apiiro, we are analyzing the text in the user stories in your Jira or any other ticketing systems. And then based on the intent, based on the knowledge of the developer and the PM that are assigned, we are raising a flag and saying, hey, Darren, this is a potential risk to the application. Go talk to this guy and run a threat model. And this is it's happening before you start coding. And this is very important to emphasize this point, because we are trying to educate the market. Like, the market doesn't know that this capability exists, okay? We have our own customers that are using this capability, but for others, this is why I'm here, to talk and articulate this message and hopefully convince other customers as well to use this approach.
My mind is racing. It's swimming. Every time you talk, it feels like you could just do a mic drop at any point, because these are such big statements. And because we've seen teams that have built Tiger teams, they've built guilds, they spend some time, like this week we're going to work with this product team. It's not intelligently driven. It's the intention is there, but you still can't keep up. And everything you just said is, I hope people will listen, they'll re-listen, because there's wisdom, there's so much wisdom in what you've built and that has to be captured. In fact, we went to RSA. And we spent some time with Idan, and he walked us through this risk graph. And I was floored at how many layers deep we went. Started with something like, let's just call it 10,000 alerts. And Idan just kept showing how we can ask deeper and deeper and more contextual questions. And it arrives with 2 alerts. And those 2 alerts matter. That's one piece of this. But there's so many pieces of this. Even Apiiro is a play on the Greek word for infinity. You're closing the loops constantly. You're almost this central nervous system. You know if we lost a leg versus if we have a paper cut. You know where to focus your energies, and you know who to involve, and you know what to involve once they get alerted. So you're doing so many things. So let me, go ahead.
I'm just saying, Darren, again, we as practitioners, we know how complex application security is. It's so complex because on one hand, you want to help developers fix the risks before. In some cases, the risk is already deployed. In some cases, you want to trigger contextual pen testing based on material changes. In some cases, you want to trigger contextual training based on mistakes that you are doing. So there are so many use cases, and I think there is no one cookbook on how to build an AppSec program. And it's not like, let's take cloud security, for example. Cloud security is like very structured. You know what are the resources that you have in the cloud, and you have best practices. It's like, putting a firewall rule or identity and access management policy. Here, it's code, it's humans, it's multiple tools, it's multiple layers. It's 15 years more than of legacy work and processes. It's manual questionnaires. It's AppSec is so complex, and what we are trying to do is just to simplify. And how do you simplify things? You first and foremost, you build a layer that helps you understand what you have and who is the owner, and then you can then it's an eye-opening. Then you can actually build a work plan. Because now people are building work plans, AppSec work plans by, hey, let's deploy a scanning tool. Let's run an Excel spreadsheet across all the application owners. And this is the wrong way to do it, because we are business-driven AppSec leaders. This is how I classify you, and I classified us. We are AppSec heroes that are focused on the business and not selling you yet another scanning tool. We want to measure the impact of our work, you as a top-notch consultant and advocate, and me and Apiiro as top-notch leader in the AppSec space. We want to measure what's the business value that we provide to our customers. And this is the key that we need to stick on and prove. What I'm saying, we need to prove on the data and not just saying it.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't stop there too, because the other thing you do, which I love about this, is you help identify who our security champions can be in those product teams, and we can elevate them, and we can really I guess double click or what's it called, double down on building them up and putting them on the right pedestal and helping their teams. You also find folks that maybe need different levels of investment and training. So it's not only that you're solving all these complex interrelationships constantly and assessing that risk constantly, and we should talk about the risk graph that you've exposed, because I think that's putting so much power in directly in the consumer's hands. But you're also committed to building the organization differently, building relationships differently. Yes. You said these are people doing these things. Scanning tools are needed. However, the scanning tool is not enough if we're talking about a program. We have to give people development paths, personally speaking. And so you address that side of it as well. I'm going to say, like, you are the complete package to building a program that's sustainable, that meets the need today, meets the need tomorrow with some of the graph capabilities, and is allowing me to reinvest in my staff to build these relationships.
So two things, yeah, spot on. And two things I have to say. One goes back to know what you have. Basic question.
Yeah, yep.
How many developers in Java are dealing with Spring security and adding input validation to APIs? How many developers actually fix secrets in code? How many developers are actually upgraded a dependency or a base image with vulnerability? Who knows that?
Yeah.
Such a simple question to ask, to go to Darren and say, hey, dude, you're doing an amazing job. And I want to nominate you because you can be an advocate to the other developers on what to write. And guess what? It's so expensive to build an application and a security champion program. So expensive because you need to go manually, team by team, ask people, do you want to do that? Do you want to do that? Why? We are, as part of knowing what you have, we are building a knowledge profile on every contributor. Just ask us. Ask Apiiro in 3 seconds. Show me all the developers in high business impact applications that are dealing with input validation, with encryption, with authentication, with fixing secrets.
To get to that point, Idan, what you just mentioned is like, hey, let's ask Apiiro. How do we build this abstraction layer, right? How does Apiiro, like if we'd say, this makes perfect sense, I'm in charge of the AppSec program or a CISO out there, how do I now deploy Apiiro in the equation? Where do I start with? Because I have, the traditional scanning tools already in place. What's the lowest common denominator? Because you are a platform and a very powerful one. What's your core base deployment or starting point, I should say?
This is a great question, and I will split it into two. Okay, the deployment itself, which is super technical, can be a fully software as a service platform where we manage everything for you across any cloud that you want. We're cloud agnostic. Second option is deploy us on your own managed Kubernetes cluster, again, cloud agnostic. And the third option is fully on-prem, fully in your bare metal Kubernetes cluster on-prem. This is on the deployment side, super technical, not a big issue. The second thing is, I think, the core is part of the core value prop. When from the moment you onboard into Apiiro, okay, the only thing that you need to do is to connect us via read-only API to the source control manager. No one knows that we are there. We are not blocking anyone. We are just sitting as yet another developer. We analyze all the history across the application code, open source code, configuration file, infrastructure as code, and so on and so forth. And then we build the abstraction layer. And between, let's say, 30 minutes to an hour, you can see all the inventory. Okay? I don't want to call it comprehensive SBOM because it's much, 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 much more than that. All the APIs, as I said, all the data models, all the sensitive data, everything that construct and assemble an application, you can see in Apiiro between 30 minutes to an hour. And then, okay, you can ask questions.
There you go.
And ask all these questions that we mentioned earlier, or you can say, great, Apiiro assess and assess the risk of all the repositories. Now we can augment alerts from my existing tools like SAST and SCA and IAST and DAST and even CSPM and containers and you can even enrich more context from your API gateways and Kubernetes clusters and CI/CD pipelines and Artifactory and so on and so forth. But this is for the advanced. To see value, it can be between 30 minutes to an hour while connecting us to the source control manager via API, no agent, nothing to deploy on top of your source control manager. This answer your question?
Absolutely. And Idan, it was a pleasure having you join us this today. I know it's very late over in Israel for you, so thank you so much. We believe this is truly a game-changing platform. So you have our full support behind us, behind you, I should say. Sorry, and we can't wait to work with you more closely and support the go-to-market. And for our listeners, please reach out to us. Please reach out to Apiiro, and happy to support you. Darren, any closing remarks?
I was just going to say, I'm glad you talked about implementation because I would have spent the next 2 hours down the path we were going. So I'm glad you brought it back to how do we actually start.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Idan. You're clearly a leader in this space, and we're so blessed to have you here.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.